I heard my sister-in-law's voice through the fog before I could open my eyes. "Just sign it," she said. Her voice was low, almost gentle. "The way you'd talk to someone you were about to disappoint." "He'll do what I say." "He always does." The morphine made everything feel like it was happening underwater. But my mind was sharp enough to understand exactly what was happening in that hospital room. While I lay there with a broken pelvis, 3 cracked ribs, and a collapsed lung. My name is Dara. I'm 31 years old. I'm a forensic auditor, and the people standing at the foot of my hospital bed, deciding the fate of everything I'd built, were my husband, my mother-in-law, and my sister-in-law. The woman who had been trying to dismantle my marriage since the week after our wedding. 6 days before I ended up in that ICU, I was rear-ended by a drunk driver on the I-95. Broad daylight. I was on my way back from a client site. Laptop bag on the passenger seat. Coffee going cold in the cup holder. The impact came out of nowhere. A sound like the world folding in half, and then nothing. When I woke up, my husband was sitting by my bed. He looked relieved. He squeezed my hand. He said everything was going to be okay. He was lying. Not about all of it. Not in the obvious ways. But I know my husband. I've known him for 9 years, dated for 3, married for 6. I know the way his jaw tightens when he's hiding something. I know the way he looks at his phone and angles the screen away from me. I know the particular quality of his silence when he's already made a decision and doesn't want to tell me yet. By day 3 in that hospital, I'd clocked every single one of those signs. My mother-in-law arrived on day 2. She hugged me carefully, made a sound of concern over my bruisings, and then immediately began rearranging things. The flowers on the windowsill, the schedule of who would sit with me, the conversation. She's been rearranging things since the first time my husband brought me home for dinner, moving me into the shape she wanted, the kind of wife that fit the life she'd planned for her son. I didn't fit. I've never fit. I think that's why she's never forgiven me for marrying him. My sister-in-law came on day 3. She brought a fruit basket and wore the expression of a woman performing concern for an audience. She kissed my cheek. She called me honey. She sat in the corner of the room and watched me with her mother, and something in the way they communicated without speaking, the small looks, the careful pauses, made the back of my neck go cold. I closed my eyes and let them think I was sleeping. That's when I heard it. "Just sign it. He'll do what I say. He always does." I didn't move. I kept my breathing even. I listened to the sound of my husband's footsteps crossing the room, the low exchange of voices I couldn't fully make out, and then the door opening and closing as he left. My sister-in-law stayed behind. I could feel her standing there for a long moment. Then she left too. I waited until the room was empty before I opened my eyes. Here is what they didn't know about me. I grew up with nothing, the kind of nothing that makes you cautious about everything. My father left before I could form a solid memory of him. My mother worked 2 jobs and still came up short most months. I put myself through college on scholarships and part-time work, then built a career in forensic auditing because I was good at spotting what people tried to hide. I've spent the last 8 years finding the financial irregularities that companies hoped no one would notice. I know how people behave when they think no one is watching, and I know how to prepare for worst-case scenarios. When my husband and I bought our house 4 years ago, I did something he thought was excessive. I hired a lawyer and made sure the deed structure was airtight. My name, his name, specific provisions about what happened to the property in the event of incapacity or dispute. I set up a private trust for the liquid assets I'd brought into the marriage. I backed up every financial document to an encrypted server that only I had full access to. My mother-in-law called it paranoid when she found out. My husband laughed it off. Said I was an auditor. I couldn't help it. I smiled and let them think that. The truth is simpler. I'd seen what happened to women who trusted too much. I'd audited enough estates and divorce proceedings to know how quickly a marriage could become a financial ambush. I wasn't planning for betrayal. I was planning the way anyone should plan. For the thing you hope never happens. Lying in that hospital bed on day 4, I was very glad I had. I asked the nurse for my phone under the pretense of needing to check work emails. She hesitated, then handed it over. The first thing I did was log into the remote desktop I use for work. From there, I accessed a monitoring application I'd installed on our home network 18 months earlier. Not because I suspected anything specific, but because I work in cybersecurity-adjacent industries, and I know what vulnerabilities look like. What I found was a paper trail. My mother-in-law had been in contact with a financial planner. One I didn't know. One who wasn't our financial planner. 3 weeks before my accident. The emails were routed through my husband's personal account. There were references to asset consolidation, to restructuring, to what one email chillingly referred to as simplifying the ownership situation. They'd been planning something before I was ever in that hospital. The accident just gave them an opening. By day 5, I understood the full shape of it. My mother-in-law had convinced my husband that our current financial structure was unnecessarily complex. Her language for it was tidy and domestic. She wanted things simplified, she said. She just wanted to make sure her son was protected. What she actually wanted was to move the majority of our marital assets into an account structure where she had co-signatory access. She'd done it before, to my father-in-law, quietly and over years, until she was the one who controlled every financial decision in that household. She'd waited 6 years to do the same to mine. My husband wasn't malicious. That's the hardest part of this to explain. He isn't a bad person. He's a person who has never successfully said no to his mother, who learned early that disagreement came with a cost, who found it easier to go along and apologized to me later. I'd watched it happen in smaller ways our entire marriage. I'd told myself it wasn't serious enough to fight over. This was serious enough. The document my sister-in-law wanted him to sign was a limited power of attorney, drafted to allow my mother-in-law to act on his behalf in financial matters, while he was, quote, occupied with my care. It was clean and legal on its surface. What it would have enabled, given the restructuring already in progress, was a complete consolidation of our joint assets into accounts I had no direct access to. They were going to do it while I was sedated and unable to object. I didn't rage. I didn't cry. I lay in that hospital bed, and I felt something settle in my chest. Cold and precise. And very, very calm. I'd been in situations like this before. Not personally, but professionally. I'd sat across tables from people who thought they'd covered every angle and showed them exactly which one they'd missed. They'd missed several. The first thing I did was call my attorney from the hospital bathroom. At 11 o'clock at night, the IV line still taped to the back of my hand. I spoke quietly, and I laid out exactly what I knew. She was silent for a long moment. Then she said, "Send me everything. I need to see the emails." I sent her everything. The second thing I did was contact our actual financial planner, the one my mother-in-law had been working around, and flag that any transactions or restructuring requests should be halted pending my written authorization. I followed that up with a formal written notice, dated and time-stamped. The third thing I did was nothing. I went back to my bed. I let my husband hold my hand. I asked my mother-in-law if she'd had a chance to eat and told her she looked tired. I let my sister-in-law show me photos of her kids on her phone and said the right things about how much they'd grown. I smiled. I was patient. I waited. What none of them knew was that the power of attorney document my sister-in-law had brought for my husband to sign had already been flagged by my attorney as potentially voidable. Not because of any flaw in the drafting, but because of the context surrounding it. Financial decisions made in the shadow of a spouse's medical incapacity, particularly when they benefit a third party, occupy a legally complicated territory. My attorney was already building the brief. I was discharged 12 days after the accident. My husband drove me home. He was attentive and careful, and clearly relieved to have me back. And some part of me watched him from the passenger seat and grieved for the version of this marriage where none of this had ever happened. But grief is a luxury. I filed it away. 3 days after I came home, my mother-in-law arrived for what she called a visit. She brought food. She sat at my kitchen table and began, in her careful, indirect way, to raise the topic of finances. She said she'd been worried. She said she just wanted to make sure things were in order. She said it might be a good time, given everything, to take a fresh look at how things were structured. I looked at her across the kitchen table. I thought about all the years I'd tried to make her like me, the dinners I'd cooked, the holidays I'd navigated, the times I'd bitten my tongue when she made comments about the way I dressed, the hours I worked, the children I hadn't yet had. I smiled at her. I said, "Actually, I've already had a chance to review everything, and I think we're in very good shape." She blinked. Something shifted in her expression. Not quite suspicion, but the particular recalibration of someone who expected the conversation to go differently. I handed her a cup of tea and changed the subject. 2 weeks later, my attorney filed. The complaint was narrow and precise. Not a dramatic, sweeping accusation, but a targeted legal action covering 3 specific things. The unauthorized financial consultations conducted using my husband's account without my knowledge. The attempted power of attorney that, per documented communications, was specifically intended to facilitate asset restructuring without my consent. And the pre-accident correspondence with the outside financial planner, which established that the activity was premeditated rather than reactive. We weren't suing my husband. We were suing my mother-in-law. When the summons arrived at her house, she called my husband first. He came home that evening with the look on his face I'd known was coming, the tightened jaw, the careful stillness. He sat down across from me at the kitchen table and said, "Did you know about this?" I said, "Yes." He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "My mother says she was trying to protect me." I said, "I know that's what she told you." He looked at his hands. I watched him. I thought about 9 years. And the particular kind of loneliness that lives inside a marriage, where one person keeps choosing someone else. He looked up. He said, "Did she actually do it, what they're saying she did?" I slid the folder across the table. The emails, the timeline, the communications with the outside planner, the draft document. He read for a long time. When he finally looked up, his face had changed. He didn't say much. He didn't have to. The case moved faster than I expected. My mother-in-law retained an attorney who made an initial attempt to characterize the whole thing as a misunderstanding. A well-meaning family member trying to help during a crisis. It was a reasonable opening position, and it might have worked if the emails hadn't been so explicit. The outside financial planner, when subpoenaed, was not eager to take any portion of the legal exposure himself. He cooperated fully. The documentation established, clearly and without much room for interpretation, that my mother-in-law had approached a financial professional to discuss restructuring the marital assets of her son's marriage, without the knowledge or consent of me, his wife, and had begun the process 3 weeks before my accident. My hospitalization had not created the plan. It had simply provided the execution window. The judge was not sympathetic. The ruling was specific and had teeth. Full reversal of any account changes made during the period in question. My mother-in-law was ordered to pay a portion of my legal fees. A permanent injunction was issued, barring her from acting in any financial capacity on behalf of either my husband or myself, without documented written consent from both of us. Her attorney had tried, during the proceedings, to introduce the idea that I was an overly suspicious, controlling wife who had created this conflict through my own paranoia. My attorney introduced my professional credentials, my employment history, and the results of 3 separate forensic audits I'd conducted in the past year that had resulted in criminal referrals. The judge moved on fairly quickly after that. But that wasn't the part that ended it. The part that ended it happened after the ruling, when my mother-in-law made one more mistake. She called me. Not my husband. Me. directly, on my cell phone, at 8:30 in the evening. She wasn't crying. That surprised me. I'd expected tears. The same tears she'd used at every family gathering when things didn't go her way. The ones that made my husband go quiet and accommodating and sorry. Instead, her voice was flat and very controlled, and she said, "You've destroyed this family." I sat with that for a moment. I said, "I protected myself." "There's a difference," she said. "He'll never forgive you for this." I said, "That's something he'll need to decide." She was quiet. Then she said, "You were never right for him." I knew it from the beginning. I thought about saying a lot of things. I thought about 9 years of trying. I thought about every dinner and holiday. And swallowed comment. I thought about the hospital room. And the sound of her voice, saying, "Just sign it." I said, "I know you believe that. I hope someday you understand why it was never your decision to make." Then I ended the call. My husband and I are still married. That's the part people always seem surprised by when I tell this story. They expect a clean ending. The marriage either perfectly repaired or dramatically dissolved. But life isn't usually that architectural. We went to counseling. We had the conversations we'd been avoiding for years. Some of them were bad. Some of them were necessary. Some of them were both. What changed is that he finally said no to her. Not in a dramatic public way, just quietly, in the way that counts. He told her that any further interference in our marriage or our finances would result in him ending contact. He meant it. She tested it once. And he held the line. I watched him do it. I think it was the hardest thing he'd ever done. I also think it was the first time in our marriage that I fully trusted him. My mother-in-law didn't speak to us for 4 months. When she finally reached out, something in her approach had changed. Not warm, not apologetic, but more careful. Measured. Like a person who had learned that the consequences were real. My sister-in-law has never directly addressed any of it. She shows up at family events and is polite in the thin, surface way of someone who knows she lost something but won't name what it was. I don't need her to. What I know is this: the audit instinct that made me seem paranoid. The encrypted server, the careful trust structure, the document trail. That instinct wasn't pathology. It was preparation. It was everything I'd learned from a childhood where no one was coming to fix things for me, and a career spent watching people discover too late what they should have documented. They thought my caution was a flaw. They thought the accident gave them a window. They didn't know. I'd already seen the window and locked it from the inside. I still work in forensic auditing. I still come home to the same kitchen, the same house with my name on the deed. The same husband who is learning, slowly and with real effort, to be the partner I needed him to be. Some nights I sit at that kitchen table after dinner and think about how close it came. How if I'd been less careful, less prepared, the landscape of my life would look entirely different now. How my mother-in-law would be co-signatory on accounts that took me a decade to build. How I would have woken up from that hospital, stay into a life that had been quietly rearranged without me. But I wasn't less careful. And the thing they never understood, the thing I've spent my whole career understanding, is that the most dangerous audits aren't the ones where someone tried to hide everything. They're the ones where someone assumed you wouldn't look.